In this video, I wanted to create something that showed real hill terrain. Not the small hills or bumps that get placed on the landscape that are commonly made for wargaming, not that there's anything wrong with them, but vast sweeping hills that are the landscape. Welcome to the archive, my name's Matt. I made three main types of piece: concave, convex and straight. With these you can make a huge range of hilly terrain, from wide winding valleys to vast sloped hills of adventure and exploration. Nothing quite says quest like travelling over hills, and usually you find yourself in a bit of trouble. The corners of these are 12 inches across. These take up more storage than the straight pieces in order to look more realistic and curve more smoothly, but they still fit neatly in these custom storage boxes that I've showed how to make in a previous video. If you prefer saving storage space, there's an easy way around this using mountain blocks as corners. This way you only need to make the smaller straight pieces, and you can just make all corners into rocky outcroppings. Alternatively, you can make these corner curves 9 inches big instead, using the same techniques. You'll get a tighter turn, but it'll still work. With the straight pieces, I made some 6 inches wide and some 3 inches wide, for variety and flexibility. Beyond that, I made some 3-inch wide ones with roads on them, to allow my road tiles to travel up hills. I made the bases from 1/2 inch thick XPS foam, 6 inches by 6 inches and 3 inches by 6 inches for the straights. They're nice and simple. For the curves, I made them from 2 6-inch by 6-inch squares, 2 3-inch by 3-inch squares and 4 diagonal half squares, all hot glued together into giant rupees. I did it like this because I can't get access to 1/2 inch foam very easily, so I have to cut down all of my pieces to 1/2 inch through the hot wire, and the Proxxon can only fit 6-inch pieces in. Hang on, I thought the Proxxon couldn't fit 6-inch pieces in. Well, I made a few modifications. By loosening the wire and using my steel carpenter square to wedge the bar further up, and then making sure that the wire is at a nice 90-degree angle again, I can fit a 6-inch piece in. Just about, anyway. If you can get 1/2 inch foam, just cut diagonals off the corner. It's a lot easier. For the main bulk, I used expanded polystyrene, otherwise known as EPS sheets or packing polystyrene, cut into 3-inch and 6-inch squares and diagonals, and glued together like this. The only exception was at the back of the corners, where I used XPS in the top layer. This was mainly to make sure it would line up smoothly with other XPS tiles connected at the top, because EPS can be a bit bumpy and imprecise, as well as provide a solid home for the optional magnets that help hold this piece together. These triangle pieces can be removed when needed to make back-to-back hills, which makes some pretty epic fight backdrops. So here's a nice gallery of the finished pieces while I thank my generous patrons, without whom these videos could not be made. That support is absolutely crucial. Without enough patrons in the long run, I quite simply couldn't afford to continue with these videos, so thank you so much to everyone who helps out. There's also a bunch of benefits to being a patron, because I like to say thank you, including templates, printables, bonus videos, live streams and polls on what exactly I make next. So if any of that sounds good, please check it out. The straight pieces were far simpler, with just a 6-inch square on the bottom and then a 4-inch piece and a 2-inch piece, stepping up as it goes back, using XPS as the top piece for a smooth back to connect with. Something else to bear in mind with EPS is that it's a lot more sensitive to the hot wire than the XPS that you might be used to using, so you'll probably want to use a low temperature when cutting it to make sure it doesn't melt away too much and make the cut just that little bit inaccurate. I then drew a wavy template on the sides so they'll all line up, and cut the edge to match it with a knife, plucking off just enough to see a rough guide, before cutting the rest to match that shape in an incline over 6 inches with a handheld hot wire, though you could use a knife for this. For the larger pieces, I cut chunks off using the templated edge as a guide until I had a slope stretching smoothly across. I added magnets to the main edges of the hill at the bottom and top to line up with floor tiles, and also added magnets to diagonal tiles to reconnect them when needed. Which side is north and south for these magnets and how far they are from each other is relevant to other future builds in the system. It's essentially going to allow me to attach wall tiles to these diagonal tiles in future and make them all compatible with each other. During this process, both my handheld hot wire and my hot glue gun broke. You have served well, little soldier. Rest in peace. But getting a new one, even with the fastest delivery, wasn't going to be fast enough for the glue gun. Luckily, my fiancée stepped in and dug me out of the problem by letting me use her old hot glue gun.
Well, I had to bribe the DM somehow.
And though I'm very grateful for her letting me use it, I think I've realised why some people have been having problems gluing magnets in. There is a huge difference between a cheap hot glue gun and even a mid-range one. Mine wasn't exactly expensive, but it held the glue stick firm when not being used, and didn't constantly dribble hot glue with the slightest movement. It also had a thinner nozzle, still not as thin as the one that I'm getting, which I've updated on my equipment list, but thin enough to make a smaller hole so that the magnet won't drift around in it when being glued in. A smaller nozzle is always better. You can always widen the hole. It's a lot harder to make it tighter. Bottom line, a cheap one is absolutely fine if you're just starting out, but if it does start to annoy you, it is well worth the upgrade. Now I had my structure, I planned out where I was going to place some plaster outcroppings to raise the hill slope above them and make it less steep. I showed how to cast plaster outcroppings like this in my grassland video in a ton of detail, so check that out if you're wanting to use them in your own build. I staggered these across the hills, which makes it naturally less sloped in many places while still being steep. I plucked foam and used tightly bunched kitchen roll and hot glue to add height behind them if I needed. I also added indentations to the foam in various places to make the hills seem more natural and less smooth, and marked out areas where I was going to be adding a bulge with compound later. Wherever I did this, I made the majority of the dip or bulge a gentle slope, with a steeper slope nearer the edge. Much like the outcroppings, this leaves the majority of the hill playable for minis, with a few steep bits that minis can be hopped past without disrupting distance too much. These undulations also provide a more uneven surface, which helps larger models grip the hill, especially if using a hollow base, which I would highly recommend. These things are kind of designed to make playing games easier. For those of you furiously typing in the comments that this fire giant does not in fact have a hollow base, I know, I just haven't got round to upgrading her yet. To make these dips smooth and blend the outcroppings in, as well as to make some new bulges with steep sides and mostly flat tops, I smeared on some modelling compound over the dips in the EPS. I found it a lot easier to err on the side of water when mixing this stuff up. It probably makes it a little bit less hard and takes a little bit longer to dry, but it makes applying it so much easier, and you can sculpt and smooth it once it starts to harden a little. Speaking of smoothing, on 4 of the thin straights I added rough road shapes to line up with my modular road system, making the surface mostly smooth with a few deliberate bumps. Once all that was in place, I coated everything but the plaster molds in a thick coat of Mod Podge and brown, and anywhere the EPS was showing through, I gave an extra coat to try and toughen it up. For the molds themselves, I painted them using the leopard spot technique of watered down paint that I've shown before, painting on some tan colour in places lightly first, before going over with a tan and black mix for the grey. This usually turns out pretty well, but my bad luck streak continued here, and some of the pieces turned out a little bit lighter than I was happy with. Possibly because I didn't check them out under different lighting before just saying, yep, that's fine, move on. Still turned out pretty well, thankfully, but I like sharing these mistakes. Hopefully it'll help some of you guys stop making the mistake at all. Finally, I added some arid earth with Zap liquid superglue under the outcroppings, and added my grout and dirt mix to any steep slopes to show them as exposed earth later. To seal these on, I used my usual scenic sealant mix, and this was where it turned into a total bloody nightmare. I made this particular batch of sealant with some construction PVA while I was waiting for my usual consignment from Geek Gaming. Unfortunately, this mix not only separated like oil and water at the slightest encouragement, it also stained the terrain pieces white, probably because of this. I tried to compensate by dabbing the affected areas with some wet sponge to try and rub off the effect, and this partially worked, but not nearly well enough. In the end, I took what I could get and reverted to using a scenic sealing mix of using thinned down Mod Podge. This worked much better and will probably be my new go-to. It's quick, easy to mix up, and I feel like the risk of white splotches is kind of less. Granted, the white splotches this time probably appeared because of the construction PVA. Hey, I've had luck in the past using it as normal PVA just by thinning it down. The problem, as you can see, is that it does seem to separate far more than the Mod Podge. Here's the PVA and varnish mix on the left and the Mod Podge mix on the right, both after being left standing for a few hours. But even with the normal scenic sealant mix, I feel like the Mod Podge separates out less. I'm going to test them both continuously going forwards and basically let you guys know which one I end up using. They're both fine, I just think that one might be slightly better than the other. After that complete nightmare set me back quite a bit, I got to play with the best bit that really brings these pieces to life, using my static grass applicator to apply a mix of Geek Gaming 4 and 6mm dead grass over Luke's fast drying basing glue. If you haven't used it before, this stuff is great for static grass and for basing in general, because it never stops being sticky even when dry, so the working time feels infinite. To get this grass on the steeper edges of some of the slopes, I tilted the piece by resting it on some foam so I could apply the grass at an angle, which really helped get into those hard to reach places. Don't be scared to go back over grassed areas with an applicator or even with some careful dabs of glue after tipping off the first layer of grass, especially if you feel like you've missed a bit or an area hasn't covered as well as you'd like. It won't do anything bad to the grass that you've already applied, and it makes the whole process a lot calmer and easier. If you find your applicator is a little bit less powerful than maybe it used to be, it's also important to remember that these things are battery powered, and that thing will need changing occasionally, especially if you got yours second hand like I did. To add an earthy feeling under the grass without using a ton of material, as well as add some colour variation to certain areas of the grass, I sprinkled on some of the dirt and grout mix here. The scenic sealant, Mod Podge in this case, will grab it and pull it down when sprayed. This is when the piece really comes to life, with a thin layer of 4 and 6mm Geek Gaming autumn grass, thick enough to be more green than dead, but not so much as to completely overwhelm the dead grass beneath. When doing this for the road areas, the plaster, or the patches of dirt, I shielded them with a sheet of paper while spraying the matte varnish that would hold the grass in place. Pretty much any varnish will do for this. I used cheap pound shop car lacquer. I also made sure I brushed the grass off these areas that managed to get there regardless, quickly enough to avoid it being hard to remove later. And then give the whole piece 3 coats of the Mod Podge sealant, being careful to dab up any pooling sealant on the flatter areas, and that was it done. To add insult to injury of my bad luck streak at this point, my phone smashed and died. But it hammered home something very important that I learned from the constant setbacks of this project. As crafters, I feel like we can sometimes get stuck in these streaks of bad luck. They can be extremely frustrating and make us feel like stopping the project altogether. But the important thing to remember is that these streaks never last. If we pause and take a moment, focus on something else for a little bit, and then come back to the project, it lets us calm down, remember why we're doing the project in the first place, and come back motivated to push on, fix the problem, and finish the dream we were building. So if this video had a message, I think that would be it. Take breaks, but keep pushing on. The end result is more than worth it. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share, and until next time, I'll be in the archive.